Is your relationship struggling now that you've been dealing with infertility? Do you somehow feel less connected even though you're trying to create a life together? Do you feel like they just don't get how hard this is? Has your sex life somehow turned into a chore rather than something you looked forward to? If any of those resonated with you, this episode is for you. Listen in as me and my guest, Carrie Cohen, who's a psychotherapist and relationship coach who has also struggled with fertility, break down how fertility struggles affect a relationship, some common pitfalls, and specific advice for you to get back on track. It's time to turn your relationship into a comforting and supportive presence for you on this journey rather than adding more stress to the mix. Welcome to the True Fertility Podcast. I'm your host, Lea Nicole Trujillo, therapist turned fertility emotional wellness coach, and I'm here to share the tools that helped me and my clients reclaim their joy, unpause their lives, and triple their pregnancy rates. With a 100% success rate in emotional well-being and a 60% pregnancy rate, I'm here to radically transform your journey. Join me and my amazing guest for expert strategies, practical tips, and real-life trying to conceive stories with a dash of girl talk. So let's sprinkle some baby dust because it's time for True Fertility. Welcome, guys, to another edition of the True Fertility Podcast. I'm your host, Lea Nicole Trujillo, and I am here today with my guest, Carrie Cohen.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, definitely. So it's funny because I actually zoned in on Carrie through LinkedIn, which actually I'm not very active on there, but I noticed that she was posting about fertility at that point in time and kind of caught my eye, especially since Carrie is actually a therapist as well. And we just had a lot in common. And it's just led to a kind of virtual friendship. Carrie has actually specializes in relationships and marriage coaching as well. And she's now transitioned now to focus more on just the marriage and relationship coaching now, correct?
Yes.
Yes. And now that I have branched out just from LinkedIn on stalking her, I see that she has so many great tips that are really practical for supporting your relationship and your marriage. So I really love all of the work that you put out there and all of the great content you share.
Thanks, Leah.
Yeah. And for all of you guys who may not know of Carrie, Carrie is a licensed psychotherapist for 25 years and specializes in marriage. Carrie also helps couples go from living like roommates to loving like soulmates. I love that. She works with clients all over the globe. She has helped over 500 couples heal the stress and trauma that have eroded their relationship, revitalize their love for one another, and create an extraordinary marriage that lasts a lifetime. In addition to an advanced graduate degree, Carrie spent 15 plus years post grad training specifically in couples therapy and depth psychology. She takes a comprehensive and holistic approach to working with couples. While we are going to dive specifically into how, dealing with infertility, dealing with the stress of that, that can really affect your relationship. And we want to kind of get to the source for some concrete ways to really help support our relationships moving forward with that.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. But before we get there today, I wanted to spend a little bit of time getting to know Carrie a little bit more. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask some rapid fire questions. Are you ready, Carrie?
I'm ready. I love answering questions. I don't get to do it that much in my work.
I know, right? It's always like you're asking the questions, right? And
Right.
now we're going to turn it on you a little bit, huh? Okay, so I noticed that some of your pics that you post, you have travel places in the background, like beautiful travel destinations. So I wanted to ask you, what are your favorite places that you've been and why?
Okay. God, it's a great question to start with. So I'm a big traveler. I would say I have a lot of favorites, but my first top favorite is Paris. I've been there probably almost a dozen times. I go back every time I head overseas because I can't not stop there. There's something about the lifestyle there that I find really appealing. It's relaxed, it's laid back, it's eating and drinking and having coffee. And, I just enjoy that. So that is one of my places. I am a city girl at heart. And my other favorite place, which is Hawaii. I really love Hawaii. You can get mountains, beach, rainforest, jungle, all in one state, which I find to be really incredible. You don't have to go too far to have access to sort of all of the geographical experiences there. So that's another place that I really love to visit. But I love to travel in general.
Oh, that is so cool. So I actually got engaged in Paris. It was such a cool place, and I also like really creepy things, so I actually really enjoyed the catacombs.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that. What a
It's
beautiful place to get engaged.
Yeah, I got really lucky. We actually found some great I was on this app that gives you cheap tickets. It's called Momondo, I believe. And so
Mhm.
I was able to snag some great deals, and my husband or, boyfriend at that time was like, "Oh, let me take advantage of this. This is the perfect opportunity, right?" So yeah, we did that and it was great, and I definitely want to go there in the future for sure. So I'm glad you are living my future dream here. Other question I wanted to ask you was you started recommending a few different books on your Instagram, which I love because we all love additional resources. And some of them were really interesting, definitely focused on relationships and such, but even some as interesting as like looking at tantric sex, which that's always really intriguing to me, which I've never learned about, but I'm definitely want to take a look at that book too. I wanted to know what is your personal favorite genre of books when you're in the mood for reading?
Well, I've always got 3 genres going. It's kind of how I've moved into reading. So, I always have a novel going. I'm in a book club, and that keeps me reading novels because for, I would say, a good 10 years, I stopped reading novels and was only reading clinical books and self-development books and business books. I always have a self-development book going, and I'll tell you my favorite of that. And then I always have some kind of either clinical book or business development book going. So, my favorite genre, I would have to say, is probably spiritual self development. And so it's probably, it speaks to my reason for being a therapist, I suppose. But
Mhm.
my favorite genre and my favorite, I would say, book of all times in that genre is a book by Mark Epstein called Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart. He is a therapist, a Buddhist, and a psychiatrist, and he brings it all together. So it's a great
Oh,
book.
wow. I will definitely have to put that one
Mhm.
on my list.
Mm.
It's funny that you mentioned that for a good 10 years you didn't read a novel because I feel like I can relate to that so much at this point in my life. Literally last night, I was searching like crazy for my Kindle because I wanted to read a novel. I would say I love psychology as well. So I'm always trying to read more about that, how I can better serve clients
Yeah.
or just have a deeper understanding of all aspects. I'm learning more about business as well, but that novel stuff is just like I need that in my life and I am really realizing that. So, let me know if any of your favorite novels. I'd love to know that
I
as well.
will.
Okay, my last question I have for you before we get going into today's episode is I have to ask. So, obviously, you, as we just mentioned, you're a therapist, you specialize in relationships, but does your husband ever piss you off? Do you ever fight?
So we are coming up on 20 years of marriage this summer. And
Wow. Congrats, first off.
me, thank you. He absolutely pisses me off. We don't really fight so much anymore. I would say early on, we fought a lot. And then midway through, we fought a lot. But we did a tremendous amount of work on our marriage. We did a good 5-year stint in marriage therapy. We continued to do our own very intentional work on our marriage. So he and I have this conversation because as I'm creating content sometimes about marriage, I will like bounce ideas off of him. And we have had this one conversation, which is that we've not had like an unresolved fight or like a fight in like several years. I can't think of how many, but it's really been several years because things come up and we just have conversations about it. We know how to regulate ourselves. We know how to step away from things so it doesn't escalate. And we're both really, really committed to doing that. I've just gotten a lot better at keeping that in check and balancing out so much of what I get from him from like those, irritants, which is ultimately what we all have to do if we want to stay married long term.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of refreshing to hear because you can have worked on your relationship. You can really prioritize. But if they're pissing you off or annoying you, that's going to come with the territory, right? So I don't know if we can ever fully eliminate that. I mean, we are all human. So yeah, it makes me feel better when I get annoyed with my husband about 5 times a day where he he just does something where it's like, really? You're driving me nuts. So,
No, I
yeah.
I understand that.
Can you share a little bit about your story and kind of how you got to do what you do now, though?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in the psyche from the time I was a kid. I grew up in New York, and there was a really famous psychiatric hospital that we used to drive by, which at 8, I didn't know what it was until I started asking my parents. And I was always super fascinated by really the heavy duty pathology and like mental illness. And it was a beautiful full circle moment for me because when I went to grad school, my first internship was actually at that hospital, which I clearly don't do that work these days,
Yeah.
but it was I find the human psyche incredibly fascinating. So I decided really then I started my career specializing in children and families and did a lot of work with kids working in a trauma clinic and then in foster care. I did a lot of early trauma work, which is really heavy work, as you, I'm sure, know, Leah. So I decided after that, when I had my own daughter, I didn't really want to work with kids and I didn't really want to work with trauma. And I started shifting. It was sort of a natural, organic shift to start to work with parents, i.e., couples. And so I really started shifting into couples work. And simultaneously, it was also really helpful because my husband and I were working on our marriage as well. And so being able to, it's really hard to be working on your own stuff and doing that same work. But what I found was the experience of being able to be learning about it academically in my training, going through it experientially in our therapy, and then being able to do that work with other clients. It was such a sort of a meaningful experience to me. And at this point, just seeing what's possible for my marriage and seeing what's possible for the couples I work with, I just feel so strongly about helping couples actually put the work in and be intentional about the kind of marriage they want to create. And there's really not a whole lot of limitations or obstacles that you can't overcome when both people want that.
Sometimes going through our own experiences with it, as you mentioned, can really strengthen our craft. And I think that that's kind of beautiful that you got to, take your own personal experience, take the knowledge that you're learning, take your clinical work, and really combine this into a really high quality supports for other people, who are looking to improve their marriage. Can I ask Carrie also, did you also experience infertility or struggle to conceive?
Yeah, I was just going to say that was really probably the beginning of a lot of stress for us because we spent 3 years trying to conceive. I always wanted at least 2 kids and never really thought that trying to conceive was going to be a problem. So, just for context, my daughter was born in 2009. So, we got married in '04. Started, trying 2 years later, and it took us
Hmm.
3 years. And back then, there wasn't all of the resources available from a nutritional and dietary standpoint and lifestyle standpoint. People were not really talking about that. So, after probably about a year we started to pursue fertility treatment and ultimately went through several different courses of treatment and then ultimately did IVF and had our daughter.
Hmm.
Always thought I'd have more than one child, but after that, I wasn't ready to go back through that again. It was really, really hard on us as a couple. It was hard on my own mental health. And I never felt ready. I just decided, you know what? I'm going to just feel really grateful and happy and appreciative for what we have and just start to move forward. So we have one daughter who's turning 15 this summer, and infertility and the toll it takes on couples is also just near and dear to my heart.
Totally. Congratulations on your beautiful daughter. And yeah, I mean, I think again, you have another lens to understanding some of the complexities that go on in relationships, whether it's, infertility or something else. But for our guest today, again, we're going to be focusing specifically on how fertility challenges can really impact your relationship, your marriage, and really get into the nitty gritty here and what are some concrete strategies to help support us. So, with that in mind, let's get into it. So, we all hear that infertility can put additional strain on your relationship. But can you explain maybe why?
Yes. So, a couple thoughts I have about that. One is, generally speaking, from a emotional and psychological standpoint, men and women are coming from a different place on this.
Hmm.
And so, not because they don't both want a child and not because they don't both want to have a family, but men and women are just wired so differently. And men have a very different experience month after month than women when women are, taking a pregnancy test and they see a negative or their period comes. And men get a little bit of cushion from that women do not get because it's their bodies. So the
Mm.
first strain I would say it puts on couples is that there's already a gap and some distance there in one's internal experience of what this is like to be going through this.
Hmm.
And even for the most understanding man, I believe it's really hard for them to understand. I had an ectopic pregnancy.
Mm.
And I have a super understanding husband who is his background's also in psychology. But even so, he had a different experience than me. He was there for me, he was supportive, but it was a different experience. So it can feel very isolating. And oftentimes, when women are really struggling around conception, it can be the first time that they are like this feeling of not having control over something. So, my experience is that if I want something, I put the work in and I make it happen. And for women whose minds are organized that way, trying to conceive could be the first time where you cannot just make it happen. And I think that can also create a disconnect. So there's a lot of discrepancies between each partner's internal experience, which, if not acknowledged and worked with and dealt with, and ways to find to bridge that gap, that's sort of one big wedge that can really wreak havoc on a couple.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you on the fact that men can try to empathize and be there for you, but it's different when it's happening to your body. You're the one who sees the blood, when you're the one who feels the cramping. If you're doing any sort of assisted reproductive technology, like taking the medications, feeling those side effects, they can't be you. So they are not able to fully experience everything. That can be difficult for them to fully understand and grasp that concept. I also wanted to point out another thing that I hear a lot is this is really the first time in many people's relationships that they're facing a really large challenge. Some, like, maybe everything else had been going pretty well up until this point, and then boom, this hits. And now there's this huge challenge that they have to learn to navigate and hopefully together.
Yeah. It depends on how you want to approach that challenge. So, because it's the first of many to come.
Hmm.
And so for us, we had that. And then we had a really highly spirited toddler that we were not on the same page with. And that went on for years. And then we had a year where my husband lost 3 people in his family. And then we had COVID. And it was like,
Hmm.
so it's, it's the first of many. And what I always encourage couples to do is to begin to see these challenges as an opportunity to grow in your relationship, to come together, to really strengthen and fortify the foundational elements for what's to come. Because if we don't prepare our relationship to handle adversity, it's going to break down every time there's a stressor.
Hmm.
During COVID, that was a really hard time for a lot of couples. So, what I saw in my practice is couples were either getting divorced or they were having babies. And so, you could sort of see that couples either grew much closer because they used that opportunity for their relationship, or they were so at odds with each other that the stressor was just too big for them to be able to embrace and work with. So, yes, it oftentimes is the first challenge for many couples.
So, really pouring some work into this now because it's going to better prepare you for the future, you know, regardless of how great of a life we have, we're always going to face some challenge at some point or another. We can't protect ourselves from that. It is part of life, you know? And so, again, as you mentioned, let's build that foundation now. And then the other challenges that are going to come at some point, you're going to get through those easier, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gets easier. It's harder in the beginning. I saw somebody put a post last week on Facebook. She was married 11 years and said it's been the easiest, best 11 years of her life. And it's posts like that that I find are really misleading because marriage is not easy. And
Mhm.
I think when people say that, again, you're seeing the highlight reel, but it's really not easy. And it would be like someone saying entrepreneurship is easy. It's a roller coaster and life is a roller coaster. So naturally, marriage is going to reflect the ups and downs of life. And so when you put the work in, here's my belief, and here's why I can now say that, my husband and I are pretty much on easy street. Our daughter's 14 and a half. She's
Mhm.
busy with horseback riding and competitive figure skating and school and friends. And we have a great relationships, but only because we did all of that work. Because I could imagine if we didn't do any of that work and then here we are looking at each other and it's like, okay, now what? Now
Mhm.
what do we do?
Yeah, you really have to like reconnect then at that
Mhm.
point. So we know that obviously infertility is a stressor on a relationship, on a marriage. What are some common pitfalls that couples experience during this time? Like what are some normal or things that come up often?
So I would say, so think about this idea of emotional regulation. When you have something really big happening in your life that feels like a crisis and you have a lot of like desperation and longing around it, it's on the one hand really important to be emotionally regulated and grounded because that is how we can think things through and have conversations and make decisions. But paradoxically, it is that major, major stressor that creates a lot of dysregulation and makes it hard to do that. And so,
Mhm.
one of the biggest pitfalls is not having a way to really ground and regulate yourself as an individual and as a couple. One of the things that I did, I was just really fortunate enough to find a yoga practitioner. She did fertility yoga, and again, we're talking, over 15 years ago when everybody was so secretive about IVF and infertility, and it was so shameful to like not be
Mhm.
able to conceive. And so that was part of me being able to ground myself and take care of myself. So one of the pitfalls I would say is emotional, like really forgetting to do some work around emotional regulation
Yes.
solo and in your relationship.
That is actually a core focus of what I work on with my clients is that emotional regulation piece and introducing them to a variety of tools to help support that and finding one that really works for them. But I also think that it's important, and I share this with my clients like, hey, you're working on this, great, but let's try to include your partner in this as well. So maybe this can be an additional bonding experience for you, but additionally, on top of that, it's going to help solidify this new habit that's going to be really helpful in your life. So, yes, totally with that.
And
Go
that's
ahead.
great because it gives the couple something to focus on as a couple. Because the other thing that I find that happens is that not only do women feel like they are losing themselves in this process, but their marriage goes on the back burner. And so
Mhm.
when you give a couple tools to be able to do together, it also not only does it empower her, but men feel really helpless through this process. I have a lot of empathy for men in this process, and they feel really, really helpless. And so, if they can be part of the strategy and the plan, they like to be helpful and useful. And that can be really connecting in the marriage.
Yes, definitely. I think, again, sometimes, as you mentioned, a lot of women are really big doers, right? We're used to organizing everything. We're used to planning everything. We're used to kind of, again, that lack of control. And so we're focusing all of our energy into doing everything we can to kind of improve our chances of having, that baby. But as you mentioned, sometimes your partner feels sidelined in a way and they're not really sure how to support. And I think it's important to kind of bring them into the loop because then you may start to feel resentful over time that I'm doing all of these things and you're not seeing maybe your partner join in as much as you would have hoped or feel like they're not changing their lifestyle. And so it's important to kind of share with them too, like exactly what you want them to do specifically too. Like, hey, I'm really overwhelmed over here because I'm doing all these new things. How about you take over the laundry for me? Do you feel
Mhm.
like that is helpful or how do you see that? Has infertility taken too much from you? Are you unsure how you can keep going on this path? Maybe you've tried some affirmations, but it's just not cutting it. If this sounds like you need the Resilience Roadmap for Trying to Conceive. It's a free step-by-step guide to reclaim your joy and unpause your life that I use with clients to get unparalleled results. Get yours today by going to www.leanicolecoaching.com. That's LEANICOLE coaching.com or check the show notes for the link.
I think that you're also just describing sharing the mental and physical load. And I think that if we even just think about mental load, most women, they pretty much feel over capacity. And so, any way that husbands can take some of that off of their plate, whether it be the thinking about things, the figuring out things, the planning. In the couples that I work with where they're doing fertility treatment, we talk about the amount of administrative tasks that requires to be corresponding with the clinic and getting the meds. I encourage couples to have the husband be the liaison so that she can just focus on getting her mind and her body prepared for what's to come rather than also managing the administrative tasks of the fertility clinic.
Mhm.
So, yes, I think any way that men are able to take off some of the mental load and the physical load is really helpful.
Yeah, 100%.
Let's talk about another pitfall. We can talk about what happens with the couple's sex life. It becomes really mechanical.
Mhm.
And depending upon how many months you're trying, the longer that goes on, the more mechanical it becomes. I mean, how fun is it to be calculating when you're ovulating and only having sex then? And for women, most women, they're on a mission. Now, men want that too, but if they enjoy their sex life, they are not going to enjoy that. And that
Mhm.
starts to create some stress. So what I say to couples is, like, outside of the working sexual experiences when you know you're ovulating, have just some other beautiful experiences around physical intimacy and emotional intimacy. What I like about that is it's really less about sex per se, and it's more about how you can really connect more deeply with your partner. Start to put your into the deep, meaningful part of your relationship. It will have a cascade effect on all of the other parts of your relationship. Not that that's going to magically somehow make you conceive. But again, if we go back to what is emotionally grounding and regulating, gosh, utilizing your relationship in a very healing, therapeutic, loving way is
Mhm.
so grounding and regulating.
Can you give it that sounds really, really interesting and cool as far as like refocusing and really zoning in on your partner for a period of time. And we know you obviously have so many other things going on that sometimes it can feel like you don't have time for that. But maybe even dedicating just, 10 minutes, right, to this. Like, what is an example? This is your personal invite to join our exclusive Facebook group to dive deeper into the world of fertility with bonus clips, behind the scenes content, and intimate discussions. Here you can connect with fellow tribe members, share your experiences, and contribute your insights to shape the future of the show. And it's easy to join. Just search True Fertility Tribe on Facebook, answer a few questions, and you're in. I also have the direct link in the show notes below. See you there.
Yeah, so we can just even think about some really easier, low barrier to entry examples, like a little foot massage, like a shoulder massage, like sitting outside on your patio, listening to the birds in nature and spending 10 minutes dreaming about something for your future. See, that's the other challenge is that when you're trying to conceive, and again, the longer you're in a trying to conceive stage, the more obsessive the mind becomes and the harder it is to focus on anything else. We're
Mm,
so preoccupied with it. And I have to say that I know for me and for every other woman, that doesn't feel good, but it
mm,
feels like there's no other way. So I remember my husband and I, when we were trying to conceive, we were doing a lot of day trips, going canoeing, spending time outside in nature, not talking about like, when are we going to have this baby, but really just focusing on nourishing our connection and our
mhm,
relationship.
mhm,
And if we're thinking just about also physicality, foot massage or other kinds of like real massage with oil and romantic massage and erotic massage. And, there's lots of things you could do dressing sexy. Like sometimes when people are trying to conceive for a long time, they stop putting any effort into it. Again, it's just like, all right, it's time. Let's go into the bedroom. Men need a little sort of priming of the pump, so to speak. And so, doing fun things, keeping it interesting so that you're not really stuck in the monotony of what it feels like when you're month after month. You've got that window for trying
mhm,
to conceive.
mhm. Yeah, so focus on dating your spouse
Mhm.
essentially and just kind of
Yeah.
zoning in on them. Um, Also, you mentioned talking about fertility, kind of maybe not having that the full focus all the time. How do we get around that though if, again, one spouse wants to really talk about it all the time and the other kind of feels like it's just overwhelmed? Like they feel like that's the center of all of their conversations.
Yeah, I would say like anything in life, too much of something is not a good thing. And so to me, this could be any topic in a marriage, like only talking about your work, only talking about your kids, only
Mhm.
talking about your extended family that you can't stand. It's like too much of anything is not a good thing. And when we're going through a struggle, people handle that differently. Some people are on one end of the continuum where that's all they want to talk about, while other people are in another end of continuum where they never want to talk about it.
Mhm.
So I suggest carving out time very deliberately to be able to speak about it so that you can keep those lines of communication open and being really mindful about creating boundaries around it. Like, let's just say, for example, it was a hard emotional day for one partner, and then saying, hey, I had a really hard day. This stuff is weighing heavily on my mind. Can we carve out 20, 30 minutes tonight to have to just to be able to download about it so that I'm not carrying it myself? Because you don't want to not talk about it because then everyone carries it alone.
Mhm.
But I like putting boundaries around heavy conversations because what happens otherwise is that the entire relationship gets heavy.
Mhm.
And again, that is not fertile ground, pun intended. That is not fertile ground for making a baby, heaviness, stress in the relationship. So we need to be able to access why we're here to begin with and why we want this baby.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I love that the time limit and kind of carving that out and being upfront, saying like, "Hey, I really want to talk to you about XYZ about, my fertility or our fertility or what happened with the doctor today, whatever it is, right?" But yeah, spending putting that limit on there so it doesn't feel like, okay, we're going to be talking for hours on end about this, per se. That can kind of feel overwhelming sometimes to the other spouse. So I like that idea for sure. Do you think though on that note, do you think it is typical though that, let's say something heavier like a miscarriage
Mhm.
were to happen? I feel like sometimes there can be differences in the grieving process surrounding that. Is that typical?
Yeah. So, again, men and women have a different experience of this where the person who was carrying the baby and lost the baby is going to be much more deeply connected to the loss because it's part of their body already. Whereas for men, it's still very surreal. The person who's not carrying the baby doesn't really start to feel connected to that baby until at the very least when they start seeing the bump.
Mhm.
And maybe when they hear a heartbeat, but still, that's still very surreal.
Mhm.
So couples do grieve differently. And I have a colleague who I know the husband and the wife, and they just had a second ectopic. And I was talking to her, and then I very intentionally went up to him and talked to him as well, and just, told him I was sorry for his loss because people forget about the men in the mix of it. And so they still are having an experience. It's just
Mhm.
a different one.
Mhm. Yeah. And I feel like, again, like sometimes people report, like, well, I'm over here distraught, I'm crying, I'm, maybe looking at pictures of the embryo, or I can't seem to focus on anything other than that. And maybe they feel like their spouse is just focused on a gardening project outside, or thinking about or working extra, or saying, well, let's just try again next round. Like they seem a little less affected. And as you mentioned, people process grief differently.
Yeah, and we can just say that it's not overly helpful when you have two partners who are marinating in it. But the bridge between the one who's preoccupied with it and the one who's not is communicating about it. So the communication is the bridge because it's
Hmm.
personally, I wouldn't want my husband to be as a mess as I was because who's going to help us? One of us has to
Yeah.
sort of stay grounded, right? And if
Yeah.
we just think about the idea of co-regulation, somebody's got to really maintain that. If we then, it's a fertility podcast, but I will also make comparison to parents and children. It's like if the parent becomes a mess when the child becomes a mess, or if the parent becomes dysregulated when the child becomes dysregulated, who are we relying on to do the regulation?
Mm.
So one way to really think about it is to be able to have a good conversation with our partner and say, okay, you're the one who's in a better state mentally, and you have a better way of being able to compartmentalize. So we're going to lean on your mind to be able to get us through this and regulate. And so there's a conversation there to be had
Hmm.
where I think
Hmm.
that there's a lot of benefit in being able to make use of that.
Yeah. No, I love taking that. That's a great idea to like take that and then focus and let that person, again, as you mentioned, make some of these strategic decisions moving forward, or kind of be more in that place during this time if one person's kind of falling apart at the seams at the moment. But I also think, too, like, as you mentioned, the co regulation thing, like somebody needs to be not the one in shambles, right? So we need somebody to keep going. And I think sometimes when men possibly see their spouse, or the partner sees their spouse falling apart, they feel like they have less choice to fall apart
For
themselves. They
sure.
just kind of push through to be this quote unquote strong one in the relationship moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's a predicament for men because on the one hand, it's still society's expectation that the male will be the strong one and be the provider, and women do still look for men to be providers. So there is an expectation for men to be the strong one, while simultaneously we want them to also be emotional with us. And it is a challenge for them. I mean, it's hard for them. Women are not necessarily expected to hold the level of duality that men are in this particular regard.
Hmm.
So I think that when we can sort of understand where they're coming from and have that conversation. And I didn't want my husband to fall apart. Again, I needed somebody to be the rock. But here's where expressing that you understand, conveying that you understand what your partner's going through, and validating their feelings. I could see how painful this is for you. And then reassurance. We are going to get through this one way or another. We are going to get through this. If the partner who is less preoccupied reflects back what they're seeing, empathizes, and then validates that the feelings are deserving, and then gives reassurance, that's the communication that becomes the bridge that
Hmm.
will enable her to relax and use him for regulation.
I love the validation point. I think that's so important. I think sometimes that's all we really need is somebody, your partner, your loved ones, to say, I see you,
Mhm,
I'm here for you. I know this is painful.
mhm.
And that's so important to have. So, with that and with all of the challenges that come with it, many clients, and honestly, myself included, have had this thought that they have this big fear surrounding, like, if we don't make it through infertility, if we don't have a child, my spouse is going to leave me. Is that something that we really should be worried about during this process?
I mean, let's just think about in the last number of years, I've really taken a liking to a lot of Buddhist principles because they're wise, they're brilliant, and when you interpret them, they're practical.
Mhm.
So if we think about this idea, which is an overused term, but I'm going to extrapolate from it, we think about this idea of just being mindful, being present, is that when we are not present and when we are in the future, the symptom manifestation is anxiety and worry because we're anticipating what will be and what won't be. And when we are in the past, when we are living in the past, the symptom manifestation is depression and loss. And as a therapist, I'm never about ignoring thoughts and feelings, but what I am about is really taking control of our mind and allowing it to just be here and now, because that is one really overt example where we torture ourselves by worrying about what might or might not be in the future and by marinating in what has already happened. And there are therapeutic ways to deal with both of those. But what I would say is that when particularly a couple is going through an experience of trying to conceive and having difficulty with that, that neither of those positions are going to be very helpful for them. In fact, it just takes bandwidth away from putting the energy into where it needs to go.
Mhm.
And I think that if a couple decides that they're going to have a child one way or another, and again, some people at some point decide they're not going to try anymore because they've just been put through the ringer, right? And so I had a couple I worked with. I mean, they did 8 rounds of IVF, and it got to the point where the husband said, like, we can't do this anymore. I am like watching you disintegrate right before my eyes into a shell of a woman. And I just like, we can't do that. It gives me goosebumps talking about it because, and she just, it was such a desperate plea. It was really hard for her to get on board. And so then they started exploring other options and they finally came to adoption. And then they had one failed adoption. They were just so distraught and they finally adopted a baby. But our work before they adopted the baby was really about coming to terms with potentially what their marriage could look like without a child. I didn't start seeing them until they were 8 rounds in. And
Mhm.
then it took another year before the adoption came through. So it was at that point where we started just thinking about that and in a very safe, contained way, because that's a really scary thought for a woman who wants to carry a baby.
Mhm. So, what I hear you saying is just really being mindful, being in the present moment instead of letting the what ifs consume you.
Yeah.
And again, only really looking at those options and facing that when the due time is there.
Yes. Crossing every
Yeah.
bridge when you get to it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think you can, I would imagine that those conversations are coming up. Your partnerships, you're making those decisions together. So it's, how are we going to, what are our next steps going to be? The thought of one partner thinking that the other one's going to leave if we don't have a baby, it actually speaks to a more problematic foundational issue that's really not about infertility. It's more about some other foundational element in their relationship as if this is like some prerequisite or something. And then that just adds more pressure and expectation. And again, if we go back to what doesn't really work well for fertility, it's pressure and expectation.
Exactly. It's just kind of like a negative cycle loop that you get stuck in.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. How can we handle it if one partner is ready to try something treatment wise or move to this next step in their pursuit to starting a family together, and the other partner is hesitant or doesn't want to go there?
Mm,
For example, maybe one person's ready to go with donor eggs and the other person wants to keep trying, using their own eggs with
mhm.
IVF more.
That is a really, as you probably already know, a common challenge in couples where one's ready to move to the next step and the other one's not. And so everything's a negotiation in life and everything is a negotiation in marriage. So the further apart a couple is on any given decision, what religion do we raise our kids? How many kids do we have? Do we advance to the next stage of ART or not? Like everything is a negotiation.
Mhm.
And we can only move as fast as the slowest person in that relationship. So if one's ready and the other's not, the one who's ready has got to meet the other one who's not ready where they are,
Mm.
because the one who's not ready can't be someplace that they haven't arrived at yet. And what I encourage couples in that situation to do is go into data collection mode and collect your data. Speak with your physicians and your other trusted resources, and then gather your data and look at the big picture, and then go through a process of deduction of really what makes sense. Now, that's a very analytical process, but I do think there is a very strategic analytical process that needs to happen when people are going through fertility process, is that, you know, it's like if I'm 40 and my egg quality is really low and I've had multiple miscarriages because my eggs are not viable, does it make sense to keep putting my body through that? And so here's where I think that the facts and the data are really, really important. That couples make those decisions not from an emotional place. It's like we don't buy houses from an emotional place. We don't buy we don't make big investments from emotional places.
Mhm.
And I also don't think that we should make this from an emotional place. Now, there would have to likely be emotional work to be done, particularly if it's the woman who says, I don't want it to not be my DNA. So there's emotional work to be done, but we should do the emotional work so that we can actually make a meaningful decision that's not just from an emotional place.
Yeah, and which can be really hard, like you
So
said.
hard.
So I'm so glad that you said that you do need to do some emotional work before we can get there. Because again, yeah, like we're so intrinsically tied to this outcome that it can be so hard to,
Mhm.
you know, step back and maybe go a different route that you hadn't originally planned for.
And one other thing I think couples can do is they can have the conversation about where their limits are, where their line is. Like I
Hmm.
would have done multiple rounds of IVF had I need to. My husband probably he would have been in for 3. And then we would have had to reassess at 3. I think where we would have deviated from one another would have been adoption. That we were sort of like, okay, we'll do X rounds of IVF and then we would look at donor egg. We also were not interested in surrogacy because of all of the risks and liabilities associated with that. And so I think that couples, like, these are important conversations. Couples should sort of know where each other stands
Hmm.
before they're even in this place. It's like we shouldn't be in this place and then realize that, wow, my husband, unless he can have our own DNA baby, would never want kids. I had no idea that that was even the case. Like, we should know that going in. Now, let's say we don't, then those are conversations that, again, they need to be negotiated between partners.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's hard. I mean, I agree with you totally, but we're always so optimistic, and I love that about us. And I love being optimistic, but normally, like you start trying, you have no
Mhm.
idea even that it's going to often be a challenge. So you
Right.
don't even think these combos are necessary. Or then you move to like, well, we're going to do IVF. That definitely means I'm going to get pregnant, like first round, right?
Mhm.
And then once you realize that, hey, I might be having some difficulty, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, that's a great time and place to have these combos on the forefront.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I love
Yeah.
that idea. Carrie, is there anything else that you'd like to share as far as like specific strategies or tips to really start to connect instead of drift further apart while trying to conceive?
Yeah, a couple things. So I would say, if we go back to dating, so I think it's really important for couples to continue at whatever interval works for them, having dates. My husband and I still go on dates. And, we both work from home. We see each other a lot, but it's not the same as being out and just nourishing our relationship. So I say to couples, especially when they're going through a hard time, if we think about the two sides of marriage, we have the business, we have the personal. We need to be nurturing both sides. So dates nourish the personal side. So whether that's a date, going out and doing something fun, going for a walk, going on a picnic, dinner, and then nourishing the business side, which is, I always suggest to couples, set aside time for a weekly meeting. And some couples will say, well, my partner like won't put that on the schedule. And again, everything's a negotiation. So if you could set aside 30 minutes for a weekly sort of business meeting or state of the union meeting, I like for people to consolidate things as much as possible in their relationship with boundaries around it, because
Mhm.
otherwise all the stuff just bleeds everywhere. It's like, not that we have to be so rigidly compartmentalized and have everything in its own file and they never mix each other up, but they will bleed into each other just naturally. And so the more you can preserve the sort of the loving, meaningful friendship part of your relationship by compartmentalizing the heavy stuff and the business stuff and the logistics and the administrative stuff, the better equipped you're going to be as you move through the future stages of life. Because it gets even harder when you have little kids at home, right? Then all the conversation is just about like schedules and who's doing what, which
Mhm.
is why couples become so wayward by the time their kids are adolescents, and then their kids don't really like have as much of a need from them. I say dates at whatever interval works in your schedule. I say weekly business meetings, weekly marriage business meetings, and you could sort of create a shared note in your phone, share it with each other, and add to that. I suggest to couples that they, every night, especially when things are really stressed, carve out 10 minutes each for what I call stress less convos. So you set a timer, 10 minutes. Couples like the timer. And some couple, and then you just, it's a time to download. It's not a time to like give advice or anything. It's just a time to download. And then your partner can say at the end, is there any way that I could support you? Some couples will say, this or that feels too contrived, or that stage, I want it to happen organically. And I will stand behind this next statement, which is that if something isn't happening yet organically, it is not going to happen organically. And so we have to be intentional about it and make it happen. And then it will start to feel natural. Yeah.
That's such great advice, Carrie. So, yeah, I mean, I think in summary here, it does put more stress on your relationship when you are struggling to conceive. Various factors because of that. It can be isolating. Different spouses can kind of look at it or grieve differently, experience the fertility struggles differently as well. It also affects your sex life as well. And also, on top of that, in order to deal with that, you want to have some emotional regulation tools for yourself and as a couple. You want to focus in on connecting with each other in various ways, focusing in on kind of that dating relationship and honoring that. And have those talks. Everything is a negotiation as far as differences in the way that you're seeing your journey and working with that. And focusing in on the current moment and not worrying so much about the future or the past, focusing in on that.
Yes. And the guide that I shared with you that you'll put in the show notes, the couple's guide to conflict, is actually an emotional regulation practice that couples
Oh,
can learn together. I teach that to all of my couples because, as a precursor to doing work on your marriage, we also need to be able to be emotionally regulated to get into the work. And so it is a foundational element. For women and couples who are interested, that will just be another tool in their toolkit.
that's great, Carrie. Is there other ways that we can get to, follow you, get to connect with you?
Yeah. So I am active regularly on Instagram and also on Facebook. I have a private Facebook group exclusively for women who are married or in committed relationships. So no men allowed. I'm sorry. I host weekly workshops in there on a variety of topics and also do anonymous Q&As if women are interested. It's a really nice group of women.
That sounds really cool. So,
You're welcome.
yeah. Well, thank you so, so much, Carrie, for joining me today on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure getting to talk with you and pick your brain on something that you have such great and vast knowledge on. So, again, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Leah. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you for allowing me to share these stories, information, and tips with you, or really just allowing me to connect with you on a subject that's so dear and important to your life. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast and do me a solid and share this with your friends or anyone that you think might benefit from hearing this. Also, I'd love it if you could leave a rating or review for a deeper dive on today's episode, bonus content, and to connect with others in this space. I invite you to join True Fertility Tribe Facebook group. And last but not least, let's be friends on Instagram where I post almost daily. You can find me at True Fertility. Wishing you all baby dust. Till next time. Bye.